Testing 1 2 1 2. Testing.
Good to see you. Good.
Oh, I'm good. Thank you, sir.
Good evening, and welcome to this community forum. I'm Alan Stamm, Dean of the Batten School of Leadership and Public Policy, and your host for this event. Those present are here because we'd like to exchange views with our elected representative in Congress, a gentleman who holds a seat first contested by James Madison and James Monroe. The Batten School has held dozens of discussions with elected officials and policymakers. None have been subject to disruption or allegations of partisan imbalance. The list of guests with whom Batten students have interacted includes Governors Robert McDonald and Terry McAuliffe, Senators Jim Webb, Mark Warner, and Tim Kaine, previous Republican and Democratic representatives of this seat, Robert Hurt and Tom Perriello, other representatives from Robert Scott and Jerry Connolly to Tom Davis and Eric Cantor. Our Batten students have engaged on grounds with presidential candidates Sanders, Kasich, and O'Malley, former Supreme Court Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, top intelligence, defense, and NGO officials. Yesterday, in our school, we hosted gubernatorial candidate Tom Perriello. Today, we host Congressman Garrett. Tomorrow, we will host Senator Evan Bayh of Indiana. Monday, we will host the political commentator, Bill Kristol. This is what we do at the Batten School. As public servants at this public university, we challenge assumptions. We listen to others' views, especially to those with which we disagree. And then we search for common ground, not necessarily finding it, but we don't stop looking for it. Each of our previous guests has had a chance to communicate their thoughts and to listen to our students and community members. As dean of this school, carrying on Frank Batten's legacy, I remain deeply and personally committed to the principles of academic freedom and civil discourse. We've made every possible effort tonight to ensure the fairness of these exchanges, so central to our democracy. I will personally vigorously oppose any efforts to deny you, our community members, these rights. When we began a conversation with Congressman Garrett about this community forum, each of us here at the University of Virginia viewed this as both an academic opportunity and, in part, a public responsibility. But first and foremost, this room, this hall, is our classroom. This is in fact, the Batten School's largest classroom, so please respect it as such. Our students are preparing to lead and shape our Commonwealth and nation. Let us lead by example tonight. This audience has been selected through a random lottery of 5th District residents who have been provided 180 seats. The remaining 50 seats have gone to Batten School students selected also through a random selection lottery. Access to this forum has been limited only by the Fire Marshal of Charlottesville, who has capped this, our school's largest room, at 230. I believe there's a sign on the door verifying that. You can check on your way out. Let me state for the record the ground rules we've agreed to in an effort to advance the public interest in this conversation. As the moderator of this conversation between the Congressman and you, the audience, I invite questions from all of you. I hope in your question you will have submitted your name, where you hail from, and your question on the papers provided. In order to ensure we cover as much ground as possible, your questions will be selected by my Batten staff. Before reading your questions, I'll identify the person whose question I will read, and I'll ask you to stand to be able to hear the Congressman's response, and then you will have an opportunity to follow up or to respond to the Congressman's remarks. Please wait for a microphone Everybody thinks they have a big voice, but this is a big room. I'll ensure that you have a chance to follow up directly when necessary to make sure that your question has been addressed. What I ask and expect of you, my fellow community members, is simply what my mother would call good manners. When I was about 8 or 9 years old, I'd got in trouble in school for mouthing off to one of my teachers. On the way home, my mother said to me, "You can say anything to anyone as long as you say it politely. Please refrain from shouting, cheering, or booing." This is our largest classroom, as I said. Please treat it as such. We have not in the past, nor will I this evening, tolerate actions that violate the rights of others to hear and to be heard. Questioners giving long speeches at a certain point deny others the right to pose a question. At such point, I will prompt you to yield the floor. Please do so, or you will be asked to leave. Out of respect to you, I'll say the same to our guest if one of his responses drifts into what I deem to be filibuster territory.
As it often does.
Yes, it does. Now, let us begin with a nonpartisan welcome to the winner of last November's election to represent us in the House of Representatives, a neighbor from our community, Congressman Tom Garrett. Congressman, do you wish to say a few words before I begin with the Inquisition and questions and answers?
The Inquisition. Where's the exit? No, yeah, just I want to start off by thanking the Batten School.
Congressman Garrett, as you were saying.
Santa and his reindeer like the snow. The Batten School for having us here, and President Sullivan of the University of Virginia for exercising leadership from across 2 continents. It's just an amazing opportunity to be here at Mr. Jefferson's University and have the opportunity to exchange ideas and to know that we won't agree on all of them. We were talking about this in the green room before this, and we'd heard some chants outside that now you've all heard. Hey, hey, ho, ho, white supremacy's got to go. And my chief of staff said we were chanting, we agree. And so I think it's appropriate to extend a round of applause first to the Batten School and President Sullivan for making this happen. So I invite you to do that. And then to quote the founder of this institution who wrote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Folks, there's no place for white supremacy in the forum of Thomas Jefferson University or in the nation of the United States of America. And so I'd ask for a bipartisan round of applause that, yes, white supremacy is something that we don't welcome here. And with that, again, it's a humble and sincere thanks. It's an amazing honor, and I'm just trying to do the best I can and do what I said I was going to do when I was elected. Thank you.
Thanks, Congressman. So I'm going to exercise my moderator's prerogative here and start off with a question I think is on a lot of people's minds. There are a lot of passionate people outside this building. There are roughly 850 or so folks that signed up for the lottery for the limited number of seats in this room. Many of those would prefer to be inside with us than standing in the rain. Why the preference for a relatively small venue for this event?
Unfortunately, as we've seen on the news across the last few months, there's the potential for circumstances to go beyond the control of the folks with the best intentions, professionals, individuals who hope to ensure a free exchange of ideas. I will tell you that I've never accomplished anything meaningful in my life alone. and that a lot of the people who've helped me to have the opportunity to serve in the capacity of the congressman from the 5th District of Virginia might be, for example, 73 years old and have had both knees replaced. Might be, for example, the recipient within the last week or two of an MRI or medical procedures that mean that they're more vulnerable than perhaps other members of the population. And it was very important to me to ensure that the people who I love, who've helped me to get in this position to have this opportunity to serve, could also come to this format, could also come to this forum, and could also exchange ideas. It's been a real inspiring, I think, success to be sitting here now. And I hope that we can engage in these sorts of dialogues in larger and larger venues. I'm really excited, and I'm going to give a hat tip to Joe Thomas and WCHV to have a radio town hall starting on April 13th from 7 p.m. to 9 p.m. And we hope to do that every month or so for the duration of the time that we're given the honor to serve the 5th District. But I'd love to have a larger venue. I also wanted to know that people that I love, the people that have been there for me, could be at this venue, and they could do so without fearing for their physical well-being and safety. And so with that, we erred on the side, I think, of caution. But I would indeed enjoy the opportunity to do this in a larger venue should we prove that we can execute it here tonight at the Batten School in this limited scale.
Well, fair enough, and we'll hold you to that pledge and do another event in a much larger setting. I'm going to take your cue where you mentioned healthcare there. Allison Chavez, a Batten School student, are you here? I think I'm doing grievous harm to your last name. Thank you very much. So this is a healthcare question. There are thousands of people in your district who are working, yet they cannot afford health insurance, and many worry about lifetime benefits. What are you doing to deal with these sorts of situations?
So the paradigm that we've gotten foisted upon us as it relates to moving forward to address problems with the Affordable Care Act, and there certainly are, is that we need to ensure that all Americans have coverage, or that all people who choose to avail themselves have coverage. The problem is that there's a massive disconnect between coverage and care. And so what we've seen in the last 7 years is premiums skyrocketing, deductibles skyrocketing. I was speaking with the owners of a logging operation out of Brunswick County yesterday who described health savings plans that they had and that their employees had, where originally their deductible had been, I believe they said $750, and their monthly payment had been $250. What that illustrates is that you can have coverage, but if you don't have $6,000 for deductible, you don't have care. So the most important thing to do now is to create a paradigm where we turn the cost curve down. That's one of the reasons that we've gotten crosswise with the president. What we looked at as related to the AHCA was a plan that didn't do anything to turn the cost curve down, to reduce the rise in premiums for the next 2 years. And while it would have, according to the Congressional Budget Office moving forward after that, it would have been too little too late in a nation where 2/3 of the people, according to a recent news story, couldn't find $2,000 if they had an emergency. So I want you to think about the difference between care, which is where you get the help you need from a medical professional when you need it, and coverage, which is when you have a piece of paper that says, I have health insurance that does you absolutely no good if your deductible is so high that you can't pay for it. Some of the things that we've done that I'm very proud of include passing the McCarran-Ferguson antitrust exemption for healthcare. We championed that. That was an editorial that was featured in the Hill newspaper in Washington, D.C., I think 23 days after we were sworn in. I'm very proud of that. That ultimately passed out of committee and out of the full House and has gone to the Senate. And I will tell you that our championship of the McCarran-Ferguson repeal was something that was completely nonpartisan. I'm not sure whether it was yourself, Dean, or Professor Warburg that we discussed this with, but that was an idea originally championed, ironically, by your speaker yesterday, Tom Perriello, and Betsy Markey in 2010, that was pushed through, candidly, driven by members of the Freedom Caucus in 2017. And so that proves that nobody has a monopoly on good ideas and that there are things that we can do to bend that cost curve down. Another bill that we've passed is the right of associations to unify, to purchase in numbers to create discounts in health care. That bill's left the House and is headed to the Senate. That'll help drive down the cost curve.
Well, Congressman Garrett, let me follow up on one of the provisions of the AHCA. But before that, Allison, do you have a follow-up? All right, we'll move forward then. Susan Prokop from Nelson County. Are you with us? Thank you. Susan's got a question about provisions of the AHCA, and here we go. In rejecting the AHCA, the Freedom Caucus insisted on stripping patient protections and essential benefits from the bill. I'm a cancer survivor and a small business owner who needs these protections. Do you support these Freedom Caucus provisions? If yes, will you now reject those positions and work for a bipartisan health bill serving all the people in your district?
So essential health benefits are things that the Affordable Care Act placed in Title I of the code that regulates health care that says what things must be covered by all health plans. And so if you repeal the essential benefits from the code, then you allow yourself to purchase from a plan that suits your individual needs. So essentially, if you have a need to have coverage for items or procedures that are common for a demographic in which you fit, then you can purchase that coverage. But if you do not have a need to purchase items or procedures or treatments that are common for a demographic in which you fit, then you do not need to pay for these procedures. And so if the goal is to ensure that we don't worry so much about coverage, but that we worry about care, that is, that you can actually get the medical treatment that you need, and the way to ensure more access to care is to ensure that we drive premiums down, then removing the essential benefits plan allows us each to shop for the plan that suits us best and will immediately help to work to drive down premiums. So I stand by that.
Okay.
The corollary to that would be community ratings, and it's the same sort of concept.
Susan, do you have a response you'd like to follow up? We'll have a microphone for you in just a moment.
Thank you for your response. Appreciate it. But prior to the Affordable Care Act, there were health plans with skinnier types of benefits, and you strip away the essential health benefits, and people may be subject to being only able to afford very poor coverage health plans. And if you are a cancer survivor or have a pre-existing medical condition, you may not be able to get the kind of health plan that you need if you take away those essential health benefit requirements.
Thanks, Susan.
So I understand
Just
where
a few seconds, sir.
Yes, sir. So I understand where you're coming from. What we want is to allow the market to work so that people can choose what components of the plan they choose to have. And so if you don't need mental health treatment, but you're forced to pay for mental health treatment, then you know that your care and coverage, your coverage will cost more. And if it costs more and you can't pay your deductible, then you're denied the right to care.
All right, let me follow up. This is related to the health care issue, but is a sort of an explicitly political question from Nancy Rodland of Green. Nancy, are you with us? Thank you. So, Congressman Garrett, because you recently voted a firm no on the American Health Care Act bill and a member of the House Freedom Caucus, are you concerned about President Trump or other Republican colleagues running a candidate against you in the primaries in 2018?
You know, honest to Pete, if you sit around and we worry about whether or not your road to re-election is going to be harder or easier, then you're not focused on what you were elected to do. And my father, God rest his soul, who died from cancer, my mother's beaten it 3 times, told me when I was young that he felt like if you look people in the eyes and said, this is what I believe in, this is what I'm going to do, and then you go and you try to do it, that they'll respect you, and that's a recipe for success. And so I think that's what we're trying to do. You know what? I'm not married to a title. I'm Tom Garrett from, born and raised and graduated from Louisa County High School, and I'm just me. And so if I'm somewhere else in 2 years, I'll have more free time, I guess. But I'm not concerned with it. We're going to be who we are. Some of you guys are going to think it's wonderful, and some of you guys are going to hate it, and that's what makes America such an amazing place. Because we can have forums like this. We can even yell and scream at each other. But we're not going to kill each other, and we're going to continue to fight for what we believe in, even when it's the opposite of each other. So yeah, whatever. I mean, run somebody against me. I don't care. I want to do my job the best I can do it, so that when I stand before my Creator, I say I left it all on the field. I did everything I could do.
We appreciate your sincerity. Our next question, this will be our last one on healthcare, and then we'll move to another topic. This is from Allison Miller of Crozet. Allison, are you with us? Thanks. 8 years ago, my uncle died due to a prescription drug overdose. I've had many friends and family struggle with substance abuse and mental health issues since then, but get the treatment they needed because of the essential health benefit and ACA subsidies. Every proposed new plan would undermine or eliminate this coverage. Will you promise to vote against any plan that would remove the requirement these services be covered or make them harder to afford?
No, in fact, I will not vote for a plan that leaves essential health benefits in it. And it's a fundamental... no, I apologize because I don't want to encourage you guys to do stuff that they're trying to stop you from doing as it relates to being civil. I'm not going to sit here, try to figure out what you want to hear and then say it. Let the other politicians do that. I'm going to tell you what I believe, and I'm going to tell you why, and then you can go, I totally disagree with that guy, and then we'll have an election in 2 years, and I might lose, and that's okay. No, ma'am. I'm sorry. I'll try to. I promise I'll try to, but sort of, it's none of this is scripted. It kind of comes out. But no, I really genuinely believe, look, I know, God bless you, okay? I was a prosecutor for 10 years. We had a fentanyl death every single year, like clockwork, prescription med in little tiny Louisa County. I watched the body of a beautiful young college student from the Virginia Commonwealth University get dragged out of a snowbank because of prescription meds that she overdosed on. But if you do not need to pay for mental health treatment, you shouldn't be forced to pay for mental health treatment, because if everyone's thrown into the same wagon, it drives everyone's rates up. And the problem, again, as I see it, and you're welcome to disagree, and I respect it, is that we have a circumstance where we have pieces of paper that say we have insurance, but we don't have access to care because we can't pay our premiums and deductibles that skyrocketed over the last 7 years. So it's okay to disagree, but no, not only will I not only vote for it if it has it, I won't vote for it if it does.
Fair enough. We're going to shift gears here a little bit away from healthcare, and we're going to move to our... Oh, I'm sorry. Excuse me. Ma'am, would you like to follow up?
Oh. Okay. Respectfully, I would just submit that there's a difference between care and coverage, but if you don't have coverage, that pretty much obliterates the chance for people getting care, whatever the coverage is. I would also submit that we don't always know in advance when we're going to need, in particular, mental health care and substance abuse. And finally, I would just say that when we talk about the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, do you believe that health care is one of those rights?
So, over half the new people who are covered under the Affordable Care Act aren't covered by the Affordable Care Act, they're covered by Medicaid, which is indigent.
Excuse us, we'd like to hear the Congressman respond. Thank you.
Which is essentially indigent care. It's people who can't pay for care, who are swept up into a safety net, which we should have in this United States, the most prosperous nation in the world. But it's indicative of the failure of the Affordable Care Act, where the individual mandate can so frequently be flouted that you have millions upon millions of people who remain uncovered because they've done something that's inherent to a free market, and that is exercise their own free will. And ultimately, if you go into a hospital emergency room, you will read on the wall that the hospital emergency room may not refuse care to anyone based on any circumstance, to include even their citizenship status. And I support that too, because we don't need people in this most prosperous nation on the planet dying in the gutters. But when you try to create a paradigm that's been falsely pushed as providing something to people that it doesn't, that is health care, when in fact we have now almost 100 fewer providers than we did 7 years ago, that was sold to us on a promise that our premiums would drop by $2,500 a year. They didn't. That if we liked our doctor, we could keep them. We couldn't. That if we liked our plan, we could keep it. We couldn't. That deductibles would drop. They didn't. Then it's time to look for some different way to deliver that good and service. And so what we have is a circumstance where the Democrat governor of Minnesota says the Affordable Care Act isn't and it's destroying our state, and where Bill Clinton, former president, says this thing's the biggest joke, unquote. So what we're trying to do is listen to ideas from all sides of the aisle, which is why I was a champion of the McCarran-Ferguson repeal, first advanced by Democrat Tom Perriello, to find ways to drive the cost down so that people don't just have coverage, they have care. But there is a right to indigent care now that existed prior to the ACA and will exist after what we do, because that's not who we are as a nation.
Thank you. Our next question, we're going to shift gears and never let it be said that we shy away from controversial topics in these complicated times. The next topic we're going to talk about is our views on President Trump. Madeline Hauk is a Batten School student. Thanks, Madeline. Subject of the question here is the relationship of the Freedom Caucus and President Trump. President Trump suggested this week that he may campaign against the Freedom Caucus in 2018 and may be willing to work with Democrats over the Freedom Caucus in the near future. Would you consider to support President Trump? And what do you think of this strategy as a way to achieve political outcomes?
But I'm sorry, there's a part of the question I didn't hear. Would I consider to support President Trump?
Yes, that's right. So this is a question in part about party discipline as a critical aspect of the way that legislation is passed through Congress today. We're in a more partisan environment than we've been in some times. There are precedents for it. But party discipline is something that party leadership of both the Democrats and Republicans value highly. President Trump has indicated recently, in the last week, that if he sees the Freedom Caucus as blocking his ability to achieve his goals, he would be willing to work with the Democrats. As a Republican, how do you respond to that, and how do you view this on the part of President Trump?
When I ran for Congress, I didn't promise President Trump a darn thing, but I promised you an awful lot. And so it was amusing to me for a while to see people say, oh, don't be a rubber stamp for President Trump, particularly in light of the fact that's a great question because somebody's really paying attention to current events, particularly in light of the last few weeks. I'm going to be who I said I was going to be. I owed President Trump nothing other than the respect due to the office that he holds, but I owe the voters of the 5th District, who I said this is what I believe and this is what I'm going to try to do, my word, that I keep my word. And so it's interesting as we get to know President Trump. It's interesting as we get to know President Trump to see what tactics he engages in as he works on the art of the deal. He I think, very rightfully said early on that maybe NATO had lost its usefulness and that we needed to relook the NATO alliance. And immediately thereafter, our NATO allies agreed to up their defense spending. What he was really doing is saying, you guys need to chip in and do your fair share. And that was right, and he got a good outcome. But if he threatens me, he's going to get a different outcome. What I'm going to continue to do is be who I said I am, do the best I can do to do what I said I was going to do. And sometimes that's going to mean I agree with the person in the White House, and sometimes it's going to mean I don't. And as it relates to party discipline, I think it's a horrible thing. It is disgusting to me, and I know these are strong words. When I watch vote totals come down dead even across the aisle every single blooming time because somebody told somebody to vote a different way. I hold in high regard Bernie Sanders and Dennis Kucinich, while I agree with them on almost nothing, because never have I heard those gentlemen speak that I thought they were blowing smoke or saying what was politically expedient, but instead what they believed, sincerely in their core. And so to the extent that you may disagree with me, I would cut myself, if I could choose, from that same sort of cloth. Mm-hmm. Hey, Garrett's wrong, but by gosh, he's telling us what he thinks, and he does what he says he's going to do. And as it relates to the president, I want to work with him. I believe that he's the right person given the binary choice that we had, but he doesn't own me, and he never will. And anybody who does blindly what party leadership tells them to do should find something else to do with their life, because it's a disservice to America to do what party leadership tells you to do if you don't believe in your heart it's the right thing.
So let me follow up a little bit on that. A little while ago, Congress eliminated earmarks as a bit of grease to be able to address some of these bipartisan issues. Would you be in favor of revisiting that issue?
No, but I'm learning as I go. There was actually a small movement afoot that said, look, this gives us the ability to, it was garbage. What we do have is the ability to direct the procurers, et cetera, to review particular alternatives. Mm-hmm. We had a meeting this past week with a bipartisan group of Virginia congressmen about a particular product that was made in the 5th District that we wanted to get a look from government procurement officials. So instead of an earmark, which says, hey, you know, I've been here for 30 years, therefore this taxpayer money is coming to this district for this program, even if it's not the best one to protect, in this case, our soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines. This says, we think we have a good product here, please review it, and if it's the best one to do the job, then you may purchase it. So I think earmarks are ridiculous. I think that it rewards the accrual of power without merit, and I think that what we need to have is a process where we can make sure that the people who are trying to do the best they can, whether it's to ensure that Americans are provided with actual affordable care or that our men and women in uniform have the best equipment they can have, can review.
Thanks.
Across that
Madeline,
gamut.
would you like to follow up? Oh. All right, let's move forward. Next question is from Merritt Baines from Green. Hi, Merritt. This question has to do with security and taxes and the President Trump. Thank you for your service, Tom Garrett. My husband is a Department of Army civilian and also worked at the Central Intelligence Agency. At both places, he was required to divulge his taxes and investments to ensure no apparent conflicts of interest or control by a foreign power. Do you feel that Donald Trump, our president, should do the same?
Well, I think he has. I mean, ultimately, if you've...
Well,
Wait.
Congressman Garrett, with all due respect, I think that it would be fair to say, absent the 2 pages of his 2005 return that was leaked, that he has not been completely forthright in providing us.
I mean, are you suggesting that he has not filed with the IRS and that the federal government doesn't have Donald Trump's tax paperwork?
No, I believe the question, the spirit of the question is that he should share his tax returns with the public, make those available as most of his predecessors have done so.
I don't care. I mean, I really don't. I don't think it's that big a deal. That's okay. It's all right to disagree with me. Ma'am? I do think, you know, as we try to tackle things like health care and tax reform, that it's a red herring. I'll say this, and this is a step, if it can help us move on to actually accomplishing constructive business, then sure. I do think it was interesting when I watched MSNBC when Ms. Maddow exposed those 2 pages of 2005 documents that President Trump paid a higher effective rate than Bernie Sanders, Barack Obama, and Hillary Clinton. But yeah, you know what? If it helps us move on and discuss other stuff, sure. There's real problems in the world to be addressed, and you know.
All right. Do we have a follow-up?
I've never met him.
All right, so we'll move to our next
So it was
question.
a simple yes or no question. Is that a no from Mr. Garrett?
You know, what we ought to do, what we ought to do is well, go ahead.
I'm asking you, it's a simple yes or no question. So no, is your answer
No,
no?
let me,
Donald
well,
Trump does
what
not need,
I was trying to answer when I was told to answer. Here's what we ought to do, okay? There is no requirement that he releases tax returns. There's not one. If we believe so strongly that this should be the case, then I will put in a bill to require that future presidential candidates release their tax returns as a condition for running for office. But right now, there's absolutely no requirement that he do it. There's precedent for not having done it. And so if this is important to you, we'll file the bill next week. But there's nothing that requires him to do it. And when you submit your name for a job, you apply to the job based on the rules that exist when you apply for that job. So no, he should not have to do it as the current law stands.
Okay, our next question comes, and this is continuing in this vein, from Davy Wilson from Crozet in Albemarle County. Davy? Thanks for joining us. This question is about truth and civility, or as sometimes we refer to around these parts as truthiness. As the mother of a 4-month-old daughter, I worry about the state of our democracy, the lack of respect for facts, science, and honesty demonstrated by the Freedom Caucus and the President. I find these appalling. What will you do to promote a return to civility and to stand up for policy based on verifiable facts? A misinformed electorate cannot make good choices for America.
Can you read the first part of the question again?
Sure. First part of the question is context. As a mother of a 4-month-old daughter, I worry about the state of our democracy. The point of the question gets to a growing concern.
What I was interested in was after the background, after the first sentence, where there was sort of an accusatory allegation made that I would argue is somewhat uncivil. That if you believe a certain thing different from someone else, therefore you deny some fundamental universal truth, right? I like to say that diversity is wonderful so long as diversity is respectful of diversity. And that the one thing that's most important to know is that none of us know everything. So that as surely as I'm right on some of these subjects, I'm wrong on some of these subjects. And so too is she. So where the Freedom Caucus may have an opinion that she disagrees with, in a world of probability and statistics, there's just as great a likelihood that they're right and she's wrong.
Yeah, I think the core of Ms. Wilson's question is, what will you do, or what could you suggest others might do to help us return to or promote a sense of civility and a respect for a particular set of values, in her question, based in fact-based
So that's
reasoning?
the root of the question minus the ad hominem attack, right? Okay, what we do right now in Virginia is have every month a bipartisan, bicameral lunch. That is, and I don't think any other state does this. That is, that I will sit down at lunch once a month with Tim Kaine and Mark Warner and Dave Bratt and Jerry Connolly and the entire delegation from both houses in a room and talk about everything from issues that are important to the Commonwealth of Virginia to how our families are doing. And I think candidly that every state should do this. I like to brag or point out that when people ask me if things are as contentious as they look on TV, that at least when I was in the state Senate, they're not. And I'm still learning in Washington, and unfortunately it looks worse there. But in the state Senate, one of the things that I'd say often is if I were picking teams for the barbecue, I'd have George Barker and Chap Peterson on my team a lot sooner than I'd have Tommy Norman and Frank Wagner. Ultimately, it's easy to villainize and to vilify and to dislike someone we don't know. And so what I try to do is get to know my peers and colleagues on the other side of the aisle. Right now, I think we've got about a dozen pieces of legislation either in or in the hopper. We're chief co-patrons on 2, and of the ones that have bill numbers, I think a majority of them are co-patroned with Democrats, who we went to look for, where we specifically looked for areas where we could agree. So it's really important, as I said earlier, where I really resent that straight vote. You know, some issues are party line votes, but where you're told by leadership, we all have to be here. That person that can't stand up and say, I'm sorry, leadership, that's not where I am, shouldn't be your representative.
Congressman, so we can name it moving forward. Ms. Wilson, I think, would like to follow up,
Sure.
and then we'll move to another question.
Yeah, thank you. So I absolutely applaud the bipartisan efforts. I think that's incredibly important. And I just would argue that there has been a pretty flagrant disregard for what third-party entities would argue are facts. It can be difficult to determine what is a fact, and what you're being asked to solve. All these problems you're being asked to solve are very complex and complicated. If they weren't, they'd be solved already.
Right.
But there have been many instances in this administration already where very clear departures from fact have been utilized, and I think it's just incredibly dangerous for our democracy. I would ask that you try to, as much as you can, identify things that actually are facts, verifiable facts, and stand up for them, even if it's the other party that's...
Sure.
So our next question comes from Matt Greenspan of Charlottesville, a Batten School student. Matt, are you with us here? Please stand up. Never let it be said our students aren't paying attention. This has to do with congressional oversight. Congressman Garrett, as a member of both the Foreign Affairs and Homeland Security communities, what is your response to allegations that Russia attempted to influence the 2016 election? And how will you ensure rigorous oversight of an administration that has been hostile to congressional oversight of national security issues?
Oh, I like the second part. You know, I supported President Trump. Sometimes I think we need to sit down and go over Article 1 and Article 2 of the Constitution, because there are responsibilities that fall upon the legislative branch that he might not like, but that's the system our founders left us with, and it's the worst system in the world except for all the others, to paraphrase Winston Churchill. In other words, it's the best system in the world. I absolutely positively believe that there was an effort by the Russians to influence the elections. I know to a metaphysical certainty there were also influences by the then Soviets to influence the US election in 1980 and 1984. I know that the Russians and the United States attempted to influence Italian and Greek elections in 1948. I know that the Obama administration attempted to influence the Israeli elections in 2014. I know these things to a metaphysical certainty. And so I know that if you Google search US influence in foreign elections, you'll find a Los Angeles Times story that points to about 60 occasions that we've done that in the last few years. If someone can show me evidence that a single vote was changed, then I would say that's tantamount to an act of war, but I haven't seen it from anywhere. What is run on Russia today as it relates to leaks of documents, emails of people inside the Clinton staff that might not be flattering to the Clinton staff, which, by the way, have never been denied as it relates to their veracity, is surely intended to influence the actions of the consumers of that information. But the reality is there's no evidence that a single vote was changed, and we live in a world, for better or worse, where the Russians have been meddling in American elections and vice versa for the entirety of my lifetime and before. So again, I think, you know, let's look and see what we can find. More troubling is the apparent inability of our national security apparatus to hold as classified information which should be deemed as classified. So I think we can all agree there need to be investigations. We'd probably argue for hours over what needs to be investigated.
Thanks. Matt, do you have a follow-up?
My master's capstone is actually about protecting...
Could you speak just directly in the
sorry.
microphone?
My master's capstone is actually about helping intelligence community employees speak with or get important information to congressional oversight committees without making it public. So I'd love to talk to you more about that at some point. Also, I'd just like to follow up, where specifically, so you've mentioned this thing, and it sort of sounds like the moral equivalency argument that
I can't hear you that well.
Sorry.
Yeah,
it kind of
okay.
sounds like the moral equivalency argument that President Trump made about how Russia and the U.S. are not that different is kind of what I'm getting from your answer. So I was wondering, sort of, what do you plan to do about that? It is true that in history there is this influence.
Right.
So
So
what's the plan of the Congress going forward?
You can call it a moral equivalency argument. I'm just submitting that there's nothing new under the sun. Like, ultimately, the Democrat Party in 80 and 84 worked very closely with the nuclear freeze movement, which was financed by the Soviet Union, to work against Ronald Reagan's election to the White House the first and second time. It's a fact, right? And so what we need to do is talk about what's going on, acknowledge that absolutely, when there's a TV channel called Russia Today, and it's controlled by Russia, and they get to choose what stories they air, that they're going to attempt to influence the people who watch that program that's broadcast in English in our nation, right? So it's not moral equivalency, it's more of a, and with all due respect, because I'm not trying to be mean, it's more of a duh. So let's talk about what happens, okay? When the United States sends money to create social networking programs and social activist groups to Israel, and then the grant suspends 2 months before the election so that partisan activity, which had theretofore been prohibited, can immediately commence, and all of it is directed at not re-electing Prime Minister Netanyahu. And oh, by the way, all the money was sent to people who were campaign affiliates of either President Obama or the Clintons. We have just meddled in the elections of our allies, the Israelis. And if you Google Rob Portman and Israel in 2015, you'll find the Senate report on U.S. meddling in their elections. What we should do is demand that other nations not do that to us, and then practice what we preach, particularly as it relates to our allies. Now, there's a difference, perhaps, if you're talking about a rogue regime or a regime that doesn't respect the human rights of its citizens, et cetera. But please, somebody tell me why it is that we would try to influence the election in Israel when Israel, regardless of which party is in the prime ministership, has been an ally since 1949 or 7.
Well, I think as putting on my professorial hat for a moment, I think one of the fundamental rules of international relations, particularly for great powers, is do unto others as you hope to prevent them from doing to you. The next question is in this same line, though. A number of your constituents in this area have real concerns, or I would say real interest in your views on the Intelligence Committee given Russian involvement. This next question comes from Donna Shaughnessy of Charlottesville. Donna, thanks for joining us. I know from your years of public service and your time in the Army that you are a patriot, like me. While we differ on many issues, I believe that we both want what's best for the national security of our country. If it's determined that officials in the current administration colluded with the Russians in order to win their office, would you support their removal?
Yes, but I want to couch it with this, to be completely fair, because I like to say what I'm going to do and then do it, right? I said that earlier. If it is determined that officials within the current administration colluded with the Russians to secure their office, yes, I would support their removal.
I don't think that needs a follow-up. But we have a next question. Is there another question? I think that was pretty straightforward, up and down vote. This one's from, and this is related though, and I suspect we'll get a similar answer. But
may I speak
yeah,
to
sure,
that, though?
please.
Here's my fear. Yeah. There will be people tomorrow who declare that it is determined that officials within the current administration colluded. Because the determination is the subjective of an individual's analysis of the facts that we have. I will tell you this, there are things that I'm privy to that I can't discuss in this room, and if I believe that that is the case, I will absolutely positively support their removal. But when someone comes out on a blog and says, based on X, Y, and Z, I have determined there was collusion. So I'm not backpedaling, but I'm telling you that if I believe it, I'm with you. Somebody's going to declare it, or probably already has, and that's a little bit different.
That's right, Congressman, and there's a process, and there are two vaguely parallel processes occurring right now, one in the House and one in the Senate. This next question is with regard to the process in the House. It's from Pete Deere from Charlottesville. Pete, are you with us? Yeah, I'm right here. Wave your hand. Okay, would you mind standing up just for a moment? Thanks, Pete. Why have you not failed to call for the resignation or replacement of Devin Nunes as the House Intelligence Committee chair by Speaker Ryan? With regard to information about the Russian and intelligence leaks, as a former prosecutor, what do you think of his conduct thus far?
I don't know what Devin Nunes has done that's in any way, shape, or form remotely wrong. I really don't. I sincerely don't.
Pete, can we wait till we get a microphone for you? And we'd love to hear your follow-up. And let the congressman finish his first statement here, and then we'll certainly allow you to follow up.
What I understand is that Mr. Nunes, Congressman Nunes, received a briefing at the Eisenhower Executive Office building with relation to intelligence, dealing with communications that may have occurred between, I suppose, the President-elect's team and the Russians. Is that right? Raw intelligence intercepts. So,
wait,
in fact, honestly,
excuse me, wait a second. I don't want to turn this into a argument back and forth. But could we get a microphone for Pete on this side?
Thank you.
And honestly, Dean, I want to hear what he's saying.
Yeah, no, that's why I want to make sure we have the microphone.
This isn't actually a shouting match. I want to hear what you're saying.
Low-level staffers on the NSC colluded with Representative Nunes to provide this information for reasons that are not terribly clear. What were they doing with access to that information? Why would they have that? One of them was even going to be fired by the now National Security Advisor, H.R. McMaster, until Jared Kushner intervened to keep him on the staff. Now, I'm getting a little bit off track here. It comes back to my original question. Do you believe that Mike Flynn is a rat? And why is he willing to get immunity from prosecution in order to tell what he knows about what the Trump administration has been doing or what happened during the Trump campaign?
Okay, well, I'll hit the second question first, if that's the one that's more important to you. Is that the one you'd rather me hit? I'm serious. I'm not trying to. Would you rather me hit the second question?
Whatever you want to answer.
Okay, Kevin Reynolds, will you wave at the audience? Can you? Okay, Kevin Reynolds is my chief of staff, all right? If I were president, he would be Mike Pence. If I were President Trump, he is the number 2 guy beneath me, okay? No fewer than 6 members of Secretary of State Clinton's office not only allegedly asked for immunity, but received immunity, to include her chief of staff. That is the number 2 in her office. I don't have any idea how this Mike Flynn thing will play out. I know Devin Nunes a little bit because I've only been there 90 days. I like him and trust him. I will tell you that I was in the Army for almost 6 years, had a TSSCI clearance, and used it once that whole time. I've been in Congress for about 3 months. I won't get into what level clearance I have, and I use it every single day. So, well, not every day. I probably won't use it today, but a lot of days. It strikes me in no way, shape, or form as odd that the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee should have access to communications intercepts, particularly if they're relevant to an inquiry going on in the purview of his committee.
Congressman, something really bad has been coming out, something smelling really bad has come out of Washington, D.C. for a very long time. The smell has gotten a lot worse over the past couple of months. I'm hoping that you're going to take out the trash and not wallow in it. I really hope so, sir.
Thanks, Pete.
Thank you.
We appreciate that thought. Now, we're going to change our subject here. Don't worry, it'll be equally intense and interesting. We're going to move to immigration. Our next question comes from Kyla Kaufman from Charlottesville. Kyla, are you with us? Kayla, I'm sorry. Please stand up so folks can see you. Congressman Garrett, do you agree with the recent deportation orders of undocumented immigrants that are currently separating families and deporting hardworking people who have committed no crimes, pay taxes, and are contributing to our economy and intellectual community?
There's been absolutely no change in deportation order status as it relates to undocumenteds who are not wanted for felony criminal offenses. So what I agree with is having a set of laws on the books that we're willing to enforce. And so the debate should be, who are we willing to deport and who are we not willing to deport? Nobody's asked about marijuana, but I'll tell you that we've put forth a bill to completely remove the federal government from the regulatory scheme as it relates to marijuana. The primary reason is, it is a manifest injustice when federal law is enforced one way in one case and a different way in another case when it is supposed to be federal law. So as it relates to criminal aliens, I think that I not only agree but applaud the administration for stepping up deportation. As it relates to long-term resident aliens or dreamers, et cetera, if we have laws on the books that we will not enforce, then we need to be debating what the laws that we would enforce should be. Right now, I support upholding the law of the United States of America.
Okay, thank you for your response. I can certainly appreciate caring for the integrity of upholding the law. Unfortunately, the fact of the matter is that families are being separated. People who have not committed crimes are being deported. People who are working honest jobs, people who are paying taxes, people who are contributing to Social Security funds are being deported despite whatever the law may be. So do you indeed support what's actually happening on the ground?
Right. Everything you just recited is exactly true, just like it was under the last administration. And so I support the enforcement of the laws of the United States. And as Attorney General Sessions said during his confirmation hearings, if we don't like those laws, we should change them or elect people who will, right? It's absolutely tragic. A book that I'm pretty fond of quoting alleges that the sins of the fathers will be visited upon the children, and so too has been the case not only under this administration, but the previous and every before. And so what we need is to enforce our laws, and if we don't like those laws, we should change those laws. So I support the enforcement of the U.S. law, and if somebody wants to have a debate over how long you should be allowed to be here before you're undeportable, or who's allowed to be here, if they have children, are we not allowed to deport them, then let's have that debate. But right now, we should uphold our laws, and if we won't uphold them, we should change them.
So my question was a yes or no question. Do you support?
Yes, I support the enforcement of the laws of the United States for the third time.
So There's different ways to enforce or support the law, particularly with regard to immigration. One of those has to do with border security. Our next question is about the border wall that President Trump has proposed. Deion Sanders of Keswick, thanks for joining us. Congressman Garrett, like others in this room, I pay my fair share of taxes, and I'm not happy with wasteful spending of taxpayer dollars. The actual cost of Trump's border wall is estimated to be between $15 and $25 billion, which the American people are likely to have to pay for. The president of the National Border Patrol has said we do not need a 2,000-mile wall, but rather 400 miles, and he does not want that wall to be brick and mortar. Is your plan to agree with President Trump's proposal, or will you commit to fiscal conservatism and common sense concerning this wall?
So the wall, as it's planned, as it relates to the president's plan, and maybe the question would be better posed to him, is not an unbroken, continuous 2,000-mile wall from south of San Diego to the Gulf of Mexico. And the experts on border security have spoken loudly and clearly as it relates to what type of barrier would actually allow them to accomplish their mission. And indeed, it is not brick and mortar. One thing that galls me as a former service member is when individuals who have no time in a pair of boots begin to tell the individuals who have lots of time in those pairs of boots how to do their jobs. So, what we need to do, and what I've seen the president shift towards, is listen to the experts on securing our southern border and build a barrier that will secure our southern border to the specifications of the individuals who are responsible for guarding our southern border. As it relates to whether or not this is fiscally responsible or irresponsible, I would point to the costs of immigration, the cost on our localities that the federal government doesn't begin to reimburse as it relates to the right that young people, regardless of where they're from, have to an education, and submit that the border wall is far, far cheaper than the continued impacts on our society should we abdicate the responsibility that is preeminent amongst those granted to the federal government to secure our border.
I do have a follow-up. Right now, we're seeing that the border crossing coming from Mexico and wherever they're coming from into the U.S. is declining. In fact, it's lowest as it's been since like 1990. We are talking about spending $25 billion, and you have campaigned on being a fiscal conservative. And I would like you to tell me right now that you are not going to agree to spend that money for a problem that can be handled in other ways.
So the border crossings have dropped. The border crossings have dropped remarkably since about January 20th. And they spiked in the months leading up to January 20th. Now, I mean, I don't know if anything of significance happened on that date, but I'm sorry, that was sarcasm. But they will, I apologize. I genuinely do, I'm sorry. But I do genuinely, with every fiber of my being, believe that the fiscally prudent thing to do is to have a United States immigration policy conducted on what the needs are of the people of the United States. That we should allow people in this nation of every race and color and creed from every nation on the planet, so long as we know that they're not here to do us harm and that they make this rich tapestry richer, as opposed to costing us in the interim. And so I don't believe you have a right to be an American. I want to say that loud and clear. But I think anybody on this planet who doesn't have some secret dream to be an American maybe should reconsider that. We need to open our doors as it suits us, taking care of us. The first responsibility of the United States government is to the United States. And the only way to control how many people you have to provide goods and services for at some subsistence level is to control how many people you allow in the nation.
So, no, I'm going to direct a follow-up here. I'm going to exercise my mod. Well, you've had three, so we're going to change the direction here a little bit. Excuse me. I was going to go there, ma'am. Please excuse me. So one of the proposals that's been floated up in the last couple of days has been to tax remittances back into Mexico and use the revenues from that type of tax. If we think about border security, is this something that, in terms of the financing of it and fiscal conservatism, what's your thought about balancing different approaches to raising funds, using creative solutions to approach funds like these? And I'm not advocating any one of these or another, but just curious about, President Trump made this pledge that the Mexicans would pay for this wall. I believe those are his words. If there are different means to do this, to shift the financial burden of this, would that have an impact on the type of project that you would support?
Well, I already said I supported securing the border, and even under President Trump's current paradigm, that's not a brick and mortar wall from the Gulf of Mexico to the Pacific. As it relates to remittances, I will tell you that we have exceptions for how we track money transferred from our nation to certain Latin American countries versus everybody else in the world. Having said that, the reason I oppose things like denying one's Second Amendment rights based on the no-fly list is that's inherently racist in and of itself. And so if you track remittances, presuming that money sent from America to Mexico is going from people who aren't here legally to people who are back home, then you've presumed an awful lot that may not be true. There are lots of Americans, right? So there are lots of Americans from lots of different places in the world who have lots of family who are still there who send money back to them. So if you could be certain, perhaps, that we treated all nations the same as it related to remittances, or if you could be certain that that begs the question. If you know that the individual who you're now monitoring their financial transfers is here illegally, why are they here if you have laws that you're willing to enforce? So I think it's a neat idea on paper if you want to say Mr. Trump said he was going to make the Mexicans pay for the wall, which I thought was some interesting campaign rhetoric. But you got to take the civil liberty aspect into account. That is that there are people here who might be from Mexico, who might send money back to Mexico, who are doing absolutely nothing wrong and should be allowed to send that money back to Mexico without having to be taxed on their remittance. So yeah, you show me how it can be done and maybe I'll sign up for it. I'm very skeptical it can be done.
Okay,
not
thanks.
within an America that I'd want to live in, not within an America that treats everybody equal regardless of what color their skin is or where their ancestors are from.
So our next question from, I'm very sorry, I'm going to have a tough time with your name here, Jeannie Fotz from Charlottesville. Thank you for joining us. This is a follow-up to an observation that you made about welcoming folks from all different parts of the world and sort of building a complex American tapestry. It has to do with refugees. President Trump's travel ban stops refugees from entering the United States. Refugees undergo a series of specific screenings and interviews before they are approved. Do you agree that we should temporarily ban all refugees?
No. The question... Where's James Vandenberg? Is James Vandenberg in the room? All right, wait. Okay, James Vandenberg does pledge policy for us. James Vandenberg has spent the better part of the last 2 weeks trying to secure refugee visa status for about 17 people whose fathers or husbands or children are being held in a Sudanese prison right now. And out of 240 some odd Republicans, I was one of a very small handful that defended Trump's and heightened vetting. And I know that's not a popular thing to say here. Let me be explicitly clear. I just want to make sure that the people who are coming in for the right reasons. And I will tell you that there is precedent unclassified that I can discuss of refugees moving not only to Europe and committing acts of violence, but to the United States and committing acts of violence. And there are things beyond that which I cannot discuss. So heightened vetting, not a refugee ban, because that's stupid and un-American. Heightened vetting is our responsibility. And James Vandenberg can probably tell you horror stories about how hard it's been to get the United States Department of State to allow just under 20 people refugee status who we know exactly who they are and we know they aren't a threat to the United States. We're going to get that done. And whether it ever makes the newspapers or not, that's the kind of thing that makes me know that what I'm doing matters in this life.
I think, Congressman, whether your constituents agree with you on the details of any particular issue, I think they do appreciate that they understand how you feel on these issues. So we're going to change gears a little bit and move to energy and security. Oh, I'm sorry, we have is there a follow-up?
Yes, please. So I just want to make it clear, do you think that our current vetting system for refugees is sufficient? Thank you.
Well, I think our current vetting system for refugees who travel from states that have established infrastructure and police networks and security networks is sufficient. If you look at what President Obama's action was when he paused refugees entering from that same list of the prior 7 nations that President Trump did, there's a commonality, and that is that almost exclusively we're dealing with failed states. I can tell you again, without violating any confidence or security, that what we do, among the many things we do, is call the legal authorities and intelligentsia in the state from which these individuals are coming and say, is there a reason to be afraid that Dean Stan is a terror risk or a risk to extremist action? And when that individual is coming from a failed regime or part of a state that might be outside of the control of the government, we can't do that. The reality is that under the previous administration, I think we allowed in 2011 56 Syrians in the entire year into our country. And the next year, it was in the neighborhood of 80. The reason that was done, and I commend President Obama, was to be sure that the people who got in did not pose a threat to our nation, as sure as we could be. And I know that sometimes we're going to get one wrong, which stinks, but that doesn't mean we slam the doors and lock them. I genuinely believe, and again, I'm not here to curry favor, I'm here to tell you how I feel, that it is a responsible step to ensure that we hold until we can be as secure as we can, that the individuals who are coming in don't mean to do us harm, but simply mean to avail themselves of the opportunity that America presents to oppressed peoples across the planet.
Thanks very much. Erica Goff from Scottsville. Erica, are you with us here? Thank you very much. This is a question about, we're shifting, as I said, to a mix of environment and security. And this one has to do with climate change and sea level rise. Secretary of Defense James Mattis has said that climate change is real and a threat to American interests abroad and the Pentagon's assets everywhere. In the Hampton Roads area, our military efforts are already being affected by rising seas, storm surges, and coastal erosion that threaten our infrastructure due to geology and ecology and climate change. The region is experiencing the most rapid sea level rise on the East Coast. Do you support measures by the Defense Department to fight climate change and to protect our naval bases in Virginia?
So we've been in contact specifically with folks from Langley because we heard repeatedly during our campaign that there was a sea level rise, that the waters were lapping onto the runway, and that there might be an erosion, metaphorically and literally, of our ability to conduct missions essential from Langley. And I've been assured to my face that there is no existential problem now. What I think, will you read the last sentence of the question?
Yeah, sure. Do you support measures by the Defense Department to fight climate change and to protect our naval bases in Virginia?
I support measures by the Defense Department to protect the United States of America. I support measures as prudent by the United States to combat what we can as it relates to climate change. I do not think that the lead agency on combating climate change should be the Department of Defense. I would beg that the Department of Defense be allowed to specially focus on one mission and one mission only, and that is defending the United States of America against threats from human beings and foreign nation states who seek to do us harm. And it is, to me, and having served in the military, that sometimes veered off course as it related to what they told us our priorities were. Let's let the Department of Defense be the Department of Defense, and let's formulate our environmental policy through people like NOAA and the EPA, et cetera. It is a travesty, and I know I'm sort of hijacking your question, but it's a travesty that the DoD is being asked to lead in areas like this because it detracts from what their base mission should be.
Ms. Goff?
Yes, I do have a follow-up. So Trump's budget has proposed cuts to NOAA and their coastal grants, including in Virginia. And you just sent me a letter recently saying that you support elimination of the EPA. Will you make a commitment to oppose any budget that will eliminate or reduce the NOAA Sea grants in Virginia?
Did anybody in my office write a letter that said I support the elimination of the EPA? Well, let me see it after the event, or pass it up now, or or pass it up now. But the follow-up question is, as it relates to the budget and where we spend and where we cut, right? There was a newspaper article about a month and a half ago that cited that the wealthiest 8 people on the planet Earth had as much aggregate wealth as the lowest 50 percentile. That is, that 8 people controlled as much wealth as 3.5 billion people, the bottom half of wealth controllers on the planet. If you took every single dime from every one of those 8 people and amalgamated it with the money that came from the bottom 50 percentile, and then applied it to the current US national debt, you couldn't pay off 10%. The current US, not unfunded liabilities, but the current US national debt is greater than our annual GDP. That is, if we all stopped working for ourselves and our families today, if every entity that generated gross domestic product began to work for the government today, it would take more than a year to pay off our debt. So the real argument in Washington is, where shall we spend and where shall we not spend? It ultimately does become, and I said this repeatedly on the campaign, an existential threat to our nation if we spend ourselves to the point that we can no longer afford to service those debts. And when that train comes careening off the tracks, the most vulnerable among us will be the first to suffer. So we need to have basic fundamental safety nets, but we need to ensure that we are spending monies in a manner consistent with what is appropriate for each role of government at each level. I like to joke that I'm a big government conservative, except the government that should be big is the local government, and the government that should be small is the federal government. Jefferson said, paraphrasing, government closest to home is most efficient, most responsive, and governs best. And I've watched hundreds of thousands of dollars be poured into sidewalks in the 5th District of Virginia in towns where they don't have worthwhile sewer and water. And the mayor and the town council say, well, it was free money, but if we could have spent it on what we wanted to spend it on, it would have been on getting safe sewer and water. And I fear that when Flint, Michigan isn't a big city, but is instead Cambridge, Virginia, we won't know that people are dying because the drinking water is no good. So we need to focus on core essential functions of government at each level, and we need to make sure that we are being efficient with the expenditure of tax dollars, because literally, if you consider that our GDP is outstripped by our current debt, and then if you took the entire wealth of 50% of the population plus the wealthiest 8 people in the world, you could pay off less than 10% of the debt, you ought to know we have a spending problem. So the argument then is what's appropriate and what's not.
So let me...
It was a yes or no question. Will you make a commitment to oppose a budget that eliminates or reduces the NOAA grants? UVA is one of the 7 participating universities in Virginia for the $73 million C grant.
I'm not, no, absolutely not. Let me tell you why. I won't make a commitment to oppose or support any budget based on one single item in the budget. If you all were familiar with the campaign that occurred last November, there was a TV commercial that said, Tom Garrett was the only person to vote no money for education. I heard it a few times. I voted no against the entire budget. It had nothing to do with education. We stood up and fought for pay raises for our teachers. But when you're wasting money in other areas that aren't appropriate for the state government to be spending money in, somebody has to stand up and say no. So if you go to YouTube and Google or just search Tom Garrett and Uritz's, you'll see me standing up saying, we need to pay our teachers better, we need to pay our troopers better, we need to pay our sheriff's deputies something that's beyond the poverty level. But you can't spend money on everything, and so when you say, I'll vote against a budget that doesn't have item X, then you also say, I'm voting for a budget that does have item Y. And that means you might be spending money in ways that aren't appropriate, and that was my answer to you, which is, we can't keep doing that.
So let me follow up on this a little bit, because there's no question the budgeting process involves a complex series of trade-offs. The United States government, for better or for worse, invests in literally thousands of different financial areas in our country. The next question has to do with investing in clean energy, and this is one of the things, do we invest in clean energy or do we invest in other alternatives? Question comes from Diana Mead. Diana, are you with us here? Please stand up just for a moment as you persisted. Ms. Mead's question is, the solar industry is growing 12 times faster than the general economy. So if you really want to do something for the business community and for jobs, would you commit to investing in clean energy, wind, solar, hydro, geothermal? Is this an area of priority for the areas that we might invest in?
So what we need to do is we need to find energy that we can get to the people who produce jobs and grow our economy that is as inexpensive as it can be, so that they can take that away from the bottom line that it costs them to produce jobs and grow our economy. And I absolutely believe that we need to continue to grow and invest in clean energy, but we can't do it at the expense of all other forms, and here's why. If you understand the real challenge as it relates to clean energy technology, primarily wind and solar, it's a storage capacity challenge. That is, and not to be a smart aleck, when the sun's behind a cloud or it's dark, we're not getting energy. And when the wind's not blowing, we're not getting energy. And so there has to be a stopgap measure, which right now, unfortunately, now Washington State, for example, has a wonderful hydroelectric footprint. We could argue the impact on fisheries and on the environment of that, but their renewable portfolio is way bigger than Virginia's will ever be, because we're not going to dam the York or the Rappahannock or the James. So I do think, now having said all of this, I think that the private sector recognizes that there is growth in the solar energy, there are opportunities there, and the private sector money will drive innovation. But I'm not anti-clean energy. We just need to know that if we stop drilling oil, if we stop mining coal, that there is going to be a technological gap from the time at which we generate the storage capacity to really harness renewables to the time that we are in now, right? So it's about knowing that it's not a zero-sum game. It's about trying to be as responsible as we can as stewards as we transition towards a larger and larger renewable portfolio, but knowing that literally there's not a battery big enough to store solar or wind power when the wind stops blowing and the sun goes down. So the crux of the disagreement, if there is one, would be what's the role of the government in driving this? What we have right now is primarily a series of tax credits and incentives. I don't disagree with that. I would like to see a simpler tax code, though.
Oh, you have to hold it. Okay. I suppose my follow-up question has to do with the coal industry then. And the president insists that there is such a thing as clean coal, and I would beg to differ on that. We do have some coal industry left in Virginia, but it's diminishing rapidly. Market forces are primarily responsible for that. Maybe we should think about what we can do to support people in mining communities, make the transition out of mining. And I also want to know why you support the dumping of coal ash into streams. And that was some legislation that you voted on recently.
So we negotiate treaties, I think all too often, with some sense of collective national guilt as it relates to the United States' position among nations of the world. And we did that in Paris, and we did it in Kyoto, and we have a paradigm now where when the train cars cross on the north bank of the James River, across from the place I'm lucky enough to sleep when I'm not in Washington occasionally, in Buckingham County, they're filled with coal, and they're all going to the port of Norfolk, where they'll get on boats and they'll go to China. And for the last 8 years, we've been closing down 40, 70 coal plants a year in the United States, depending upon the year, and the Chinese have been opening them faster than we can close them down. And it strikes me that the air that we breathe, at some point, circulated not just over Virginia, but over China. And it strikes me that as we allow one group to play by one set of rules, and we hold job creators in our nation by an entirely different set of rules, that we hamstring those who really uplift and drive our economy, which creates opportunity for individuals to follow their own dreams. I oppose dumping coal ash into bodies of water. However, the argument, and I do think that hyperbole is the enemy of a good debate. The argument is over buffer distances and what can be contained where, et cetera. There's a cost-benefit analysis as it relates to what we can do economically and what we need to do as good stewards of an environment. And without the hyperbole, stripping the hyperbole away, that's where we disagree as it relates to the particular bill that you make reference to. But I get your point. The mental image, and I know it's tempting, is that Tom Garrett wants to go dump coal ash in our rivers. And if you believe that, I'm sorry, but that's not who I am.
Thank you. We're going to shift gears yet again, and now we're going to turn to the budget. And I have to say, as we go through these issues, they don't get any easier, do they? This question comes from Jerry Sauls. Jerry, are you here with us? Thank you, back there. Congressman Garrett, on your website, you state that as a veteran, you take the job of protecting others seriously and that you look forward to the opportunity to continue to serve all of those, born and unborn, in the 5th District. I want to ask you about the Supplemental Assistance Nutrition Program, or SNAP. SNAP is an effective program that lifted nearly 5 million Americans above the poverty line in 2015. In fact, 1 in 4 active military families depends on SNAP to feed their children. The current House budget plan would cut SNAP by more than $150 billion. Furthermore, Congress is considering converting SNAP and other aid programs to a block grant system, which would be disastrous for those in our region in need of your protection. In the past, Congress has been unable to ensure that block grants fund actually reach those for whom they are intended. Speaking as the wife of a Navy commander, can you promise me tonight that you will vote against any bill that cuts funding to SNAP's crucial support for Virginians and military families?
No, and here's why. Because if the argument is that the federal government does a better job ensuring that monies intended to assist people in need get to those people than the state government does, I wholly reject that argument on its face. It's tangential, but I think indicative that when I was elected to the Virginia Senate, my computer and email and office, everything worked the day before I got there. It took a month for us to get computers. It took over a month for me to have a working email. At some point, somebody had unplugged something. I'm looking for my chief of staff in our office, and he was standing there, and Kevin said, "Why are you standing there?" He goes, "Oh, I can't plug it back in." And so the concept behind block granting is to allow an entity closer to the end user, the person in need of that assistance, to be the arbiter of how the assistance is delivered. So no, I can't promise that. But it's not a zero-sum game. Let me be really clear, though. If I had my way, those tax dollars would never leave Virginia and would be administered either at the local or state level, because what we know to a metaphysical certainty is there is a cost administrative in moving money. So even the block grants fall short of what I'd like to see. If we take money from taxpayers in Virginia and we send it all the way to Washington, by the time it gets sent back down, even in the form of a block grant, we're getting back 70, 60, 50 cents on the dollar. So we can do a better job with that here in Virginia. I candidly think block granting in a state that's run as well as this Commonwealth is a better and more trustworthy alternative for delivering. And in fact, look at our community health centers. If you want examples of where people are doing more with less, if you average the cost of the number of individuals who access Virginia rural community health centers per year over the amount of money invested in them, it's $164 a year to care for hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people. And you know why? Because 51% of the people on those boards have to live in those communities and be end users, and because the monies are administrated not by people in Washington who you'll never see, not by people in Richmond, but by people right there in that community. So I won't make that promise, and I think it's a fundamental disagreement on how we can most effectively get the bang for our buck that our taxpayers deserve us to look for when we take from them and administer important government programs.
Ms. Sauls?
So how do you propose keeping that money and giving it to the families that need it instead of cutting $150 billion from the national budget? So that's a lot of money you're taking away from military families that need it to get their kids, get their education, to get them their food so that they can be there for what they need to be there for.
But it's not a zero-sum game. I mean, the Affordable Care Act took almost $1 trillion away from Medicare, but that didn't mean that seniors didn't get care. That didn't mean that President Obama took $1 trillion away from seniors. What they did is they moved it to another area because they knew. What I'm going to do is try to ensure that we can administer the monies at the most efficient level to ensure that the end user gets the best service and the taxpayer gets the best return on their investment. And right now, I can assure you, sadly, the federal government is not the most efficient level. The state of Virginia will do a better job being good stewards of your tax dollars.
So we're going to follow up on the stewardship of tax dollars. And this question comes from one of the Batten School students, Luke Nicholson. Luke, would you mind standing up so folks can see you here? Congressman Garrett, over the past 30 years, we have seen widening economic inequality between the rich and poor. The coastal elite have received tax breaks after tax breaks at the expense of working class America. Why then do you pursue and champion tax structures that cut taxes for the wealthy at the expense of social programs that help the working class?
Once again, the paradigm is a zero-sum game, and that presumes that if you cut taxes, there'll be less revenue, right? Right, so there was a president who actually espoused a theory that said if you cut taxes, you can grow the economy and generate more revenue, and you're all thinking, I'm gonna say Ronald Reagan, but it was John Kennedy. Ultimately, the burdens placed on the economy, read your history books. You can shake your head all you want, it's only true. And so the burdens placed on the producers in our economy will either lessen or increase their ability to generate revenue and create more jobs. The inherent interest of someone who has a business usually is to grow the business. So I'll tell you this, I saw a tax plan advanced recently that purported to create greater equity by going from 6 to 3 brackets, by reducing the top bracket, reducing the middle bracket, and raising the bottom bracket by 2%. I swear to you, there's no way on God's green earth I'll ever vote for that. But what I think is a false, and I don't have a problem cutting the top 2 brackets, but why on God's green earth are you raising the bottom one? But what I think is a false paradigm is that reducing taxes reduces revenue when there are multiple historical precedents for the increase in economic activity generated by the reduction in taxes to have actually had the reverse effect.
Mr. Nicholson, would you like to follow up?
Sure, yeah. So thanks for answering
thank
the
you.
question. I think what I'm getting at is it just doesn't seem feasible to actually cut these programs. It just all this talk about spending, we haven't even touched cutting the 2 largest sources of our federal budget, which are Medicare and Medicaid. So if we can't cut it, the revenue has to come from somewhere. And I've just seen in my lifetime, and probably more over your lifetime, just...
Ouch.
sorry. No, that's intended. Just the amount of federal revenue coming from the working class and the lower class is rising, and the amount contributed by the top third of our
right. I love your question.
Yeah,
I mean that. We need to simplify the tax code so much, and no offense, because I'll include Donald Trump. What was his effective rate in 2005? 25%? How on earth did Bernie Sanders pay 13%? How on earth did Hillary Clinton pay 16%? We need to simplify the tax code so your tax rate is your tax rate. Another thing that drives me crazy is that we don't tax wealth at all. So if Bill Gates doesn't earn any money in a single year, but you just finished med school and just did your residency and just got a good job, you're rich and he's not. So we need to address that paradigm as well. I really think a consumption-based tax, that sort of thing. But the other thing to address social programs that we want to continue, like Medicare, like Medicaid, is the efficiency in the expenditure. That is how we administer the program. If you do not have more money, but you need to do a better job, then you have to do a better job with the money you have. And so that's why I've been such a stickler on the AHCA. I don't think that truly, if you're honest to yourself and you read the critics from both sides of the aisle, the ACA is broken at some level. We can disagree on how much, and it needs to be fixed. I will hold out until I see a paradigm that I believe will push down premiums. And so, too, I'm not anti-Medicaid or Medicare. I hate when people, one of the big fights we had at the state level was, how do we fund the Virginia retirement system? And we had people talking about, well, we just can't do it the way we're doing it. And I said, you do not change yesterday's promise, you change tomorrow's. Don't touch my mom's Social Security, but if we can find a way that will allow other people different choices without forcing them to do it, that's the way you do it. So it's not about, it's about doing what we do differently with what we got so we can do it better, and we can. Sorry, I get passionate.
No, I get clearly, and I think you're turning out to be a little more wonkish than many people in the room expected.
I know, I read how stupid I was all over the internet.
So we are coming up at the end of our scheduled time. I looked at my reminder clock back there, says it's 7:29.
Let's do another half hour.
We have a number of questions. We have one more budget question I'd like to get to, and then we have a number of questions that get at some local policy issues. With your agreement, could we extend for another half hour?
I'd love to.
All right.
Thank you guys for being here.
Okay, I think we're going to wear out our gracious translators here.
And I talk too fast, and I'm sorry. I can't help it. It's not intentional.
Our next question.
I've never thought about how hard that was on them.
Our next question comes from Dr. E.D. Jeffrey of Ruckersville. Dr. Jeffrey? Congressman Garrett, I'd like to know what your position is on President Trump's proposal to cut funding to the NIH, your moderator is fatiguing as well, by approximately 20%. This would have a severe impact on the treatment of cancer and infectious disease. It would also affect Charlottesville's UVA community deeply, with the potential for job cuts, losses in scientific progress, and losses of research infrastructure. As one of your constituents, I'm asking you to speak out against this part of the budget proposal and instead advocate for stable scientific funding at the National Institute of Health.
We very well may. We have actually queried the folks from the White House.
May
advocate on behalf.
Okay.
We've literally gone to them and said, where are we cutting at NIH? What are we cutting at NIH? And what we've been told, and I want to trust but verify, that wasn't Kennedy, that was Reagan, is that they have infrastructure redundancies that they can eliminate and reduce costs, but that the research funding isn't being cut. So if that is indeed the case, I can support the cut. If we are cutting research funding, I'm going to have a hard time supporting the cut. But we are literally in the weeds, almost of the swamp. We're there too. Trying to figure out the specificity on the nature of the cuts. If it is redundancies in infrastructure, brick and mortar, but the doctors who are doing the research that are going to solve 21st century health challenges are still being properly funded, then I can agree with it. If it's not, then we're going to have a real hard time wrapping our arms around that one and embracing it. It's
Dr. Jeffrey?
Very important.
I do have a follow-up. Just please do look in those weeds, because as a researcher at UVA, I was a beneficiary of the infrastructure that got funded. So please make sure that it's a redundancy. When my instruments went down for power outages, that would be days of work lost for me. So
I didn't hear you that well, but...
Just make sure those infrastructure redundancies are real redundancies.
Yes, ma'am.
Because I believe that they are quite essential.
Well, thank you for what you do, and truly, I mean, we're looking. The real, and I'll complain for a second, and I'm not a victim. God's been wonderful to me, and I'm honored to have this opportunity. The real challenge for me to do my job well is the breadth of subject matter around which I must wrap my brain to make a decision, to make a vote. What I promise you is you'll see occasions, and we have the last 2 weeks, where I do not do what I'm told simply by virtue of the R beside my name, and we really are thinking about these things.
This is actually an issue area that's very dear to those of us associated with the research enterprise at the University of Virginia. One of the challenges that we face here in the health system and in the medical school is that roughly 50% of our infrastructure space is literally decades beyond its depreciation life. About 50% of our NIH-funded space is rated Class C, which means it's actually not suitable for investing in new projects. So it's an important area and one that's important for the university as well. All right, we're going to shift a little bit here to a topic that, again, I think this will serve controversial. I think there are some people that will feel quite strongly on both sides of this issue, and it has to do with the Second Amendment to the United States Constitution. Our first question on this, and we have two, comes from Allison Javits. Is that correct, from Charlottesville? Allison, thank you. This question is about gun control. Congressman Garrett, with all of the challenges in the 5th District, and you have recognized there are many, why did you introduce a bill about voiding gun safety laws in the District of Columbia a few weeks ago?
I would argue that I would argue that individuals in the District of Columbia have a right to defend themselves, and I would refer to District of Columbia's gun laws as gun unsafety laws. The reality of the matter is, and I know that there's someone who I won't call out by name in this room who's been subject to gun violence, whose life was saved by a firearm. But the reality of the statistics are that about 3.6% of residents of the district legally own a firearm, whereas about 35% of residents of Virginia legally own a firearm, and you're 10 times more likely to be shot in the District of Columbia. And someone wiser than me once said that God created men and women, or God created men, but Sam Colt made them equal. Ultimately, when I'm 80 years old and in my home, I don't want to fall subject to a predator who, by virtue of youth, can victimize me. And I believe in natural law that every individual has a right, an inherent right, to defend themselves and defend their family. But the reality of the numbers are that you are in far more danger of being victimized by a firearm and someone with that firearm in the District of Columbia, where you're not allowed to own one, than you are in Virginia, where you by and large are. And that's unfair. That is absolutely unfair to the people who want to come from the 5th District to visit us, and to any American who wants to spend time in their nation's capital.
Ms. Javits?
Yes, a follow-up. So thank you for your response. In addition to the facts that you mentioned, you're also much more likely to be harmed by a gun if you own a gun. And I'm curious how you can justify the law about the law against semi-automatic weapons and high-capacity magazines as self-defense.
So you're far, far more likely to die in an automobile accident if you own a car. You're far, far more likely to die. No, that's absolutely true. It ultimately is a question of individual liberty and trusting people and trusting people to make decisions for themselves. And so you believe, perhaps, that the government can make better decisions for us than we can, and I believe that we can make better decisions for ourselves than the government. And that's the crux of it. And women's lives are saved, again, because someone with a firearm prevents them from being murdered.
Okay.
A gun freed this nation from England. Ultimately, the Second Amendment has nothing to do with self-defense. It has to do with self-determination. But we have a natural law right not given to us by the government, but by our Creator to defend ourselves. I believe it. If you do not.
So one of the points of tension in constitutional law on the Second Amendment is whether the Second Amendment is protecting an individual versus a collective right. It seems pretty clear that you view that is interpreting it through the individual right. So with that as a given, can you talk a little bit about what, if any, types of restrictions on either types of weapons or distribution of weapons or individuals who might have access to weapons that you would be in support of?
So you have a right to be free until you break a law and go to prison. You have a right to keep and bear arms until you reach a criteria where the state says you've lost that right. You have a right to vote. You have a right to so many things, but all of these rights are subject to revocation based on your ability to color within the lines established by society. And so over the years, and I'll tell you, if I can have about 30 seconds after this,
please,
because it's fascinating, scary stuff. The concept, the Constitution must be viewed in the light of the events of the time in which it was written, right? You have to, if you understand it. And so over the years, the courts have done a pretty good job of determining, I think, what are and are not the necessary implements by which the people might take back power from an oppressive government. We don't need nuclear-powered aircraft carriers to do that. But the really frightening thing, and I know I'm going completely off on a tangent, from a cybersecurity realm, is right now that nuclear-powered aircraft carrier that you're not allowed to own isn't as dangerous as the laptop computer on some extremist desk in their mom's basement in Provo, Utah. The world we live in now, that gun can ensure your safety in a room against perhaps one aggressor, but the weapons that the courts over the years have deemed not necessary for us to have in order to preserve our ability to overthrow that oppressive government have become so commonplace that we're in an era of insecurity that we've never contemplated before.
So I'm just going to dig a little bit deeper here because, you know, for instance, in the firearms industry, one of the larger markets is on civilian versions of some militarized weapons, the AR-15s and a bunch of knockoffs of the M16 or the M4 carbine. What kind of principle, though, would you judge to make or draw the line between one of those and an aircraft carrier?
Well, I don't have to, and I'm not. You can think I'm copping out. We live in a system wherein the courts have over the years judged laws to be constitutional or unconstitutional. Heller, right? We just took a step back in the direction of the individual right to own firearms, whereas we also had an NFA that said you can't own a machine gun without, you know, getting a tax stamp, et cetera. I don't have to. The courts have done it for us. That's the beauty of the system that we inherited from our founders, right? I can disagree with the line they've drawn, but it's not my job to be the arbiter of that. And candidly, I get really frightened when a president or a member of Congress says, this is wrong. And I'll tell you what, as a guy who supported President Trump, although I scratch my head frequently, you're allowed to laugh. We've had some court setbacks recently, right? But you don't hear me screaming about the fact that the courts are illegitimate. What we do know, however, is that sometimes the courts are wrong, right? Plessy versus Ferguson or Dred Scott. Golly, Ned. Anyway, so yeah, that's not my job. The other thing that we need to keep in mind here is the courts have also given a wide latitude to the states to determine what they deem is and isn't appropriate.
That is true, but, excuse us, that is true. At the same time, Congress has and will likely pass laws that will either further restrain or expand the ability of individuals to purchase and own particular types of weapons.
Consistent with the precedent of the court. And I heard your question, but the constitutional mandate is that D.C. is overseen by Congress. And so it is, therefore, partially within my purview to ensure that my citizens can safely visit their nation's capital. D.C. is not North Carolina. It's true. Read the Constitution.
Okay, so it's a good thing that this isn't a law school, because then we would immediately be diving deep into the rabbit hole of constitutional law. So now we're going to return to spending and budgeting, but here this has to do with the Department of Homeland Security. This question comes from a Batten School student, Dakota Lipscomb. Dakota, thanks. Congressman Garrett, as a moderate Republican here at the Batten School, I'm concerned about our nation's fiscal health, as well as our national security system. Earlier this month, you supported legislation to investigate spending by the Department of Homeland Security. In your opinion, what policy reforms should we pursue to reduce Department of Homeland Security spending while not compromising national security?
So I think it's actually a bill that we're carrying that allows the review of Homeland Security expenditures to ensure that there's not waste. And that goes back to your question, which is if you're going to spend a certain amount of money, but you're not going to spend more, you better make sure you're spending it the best you can. That's sort of a fraud, waste, and abuse thing. Now, there's a fine line between auditing so much that the auditing costs money and auditing enough to make sure that you're not wasting money. If I'm not answering this question, it's not because I'm not trying. Maybe.
Yeah, so are there policy reforms rather than auditing? Are there things that we, essentially in the budgeting process, that we could change, but at the same time we wouldn't have to worry would have a straightforward negative impact on national security?
Sure. Well, one thing that we could do is start passing budgets as they're supposed to be as a series of bills as opposed to as one big omnibus package. I'd like to say jokingly that the road to hell is paved with omnibus legislation. If the leadership team and the president hadn't foisted the AHCA on us the way they did, I'd probably voted for about 85% of it, but the other 15% stunk. So we need to, I think, start passing single subject bills so that we can understand what's in the bills. I've bragged often as a member of the Virginia Senate that I never voted for a bill that I hadn't read. I wish I could say the same in 3 months in the United States Congress. It is a physical impossibility. We need to narrow the focus of that upon which we legislate, and we need to, therefore ensuring that the end user knows exactly what they're getting, how it's done, et cetera. That'll save us money because a lot of the garbage, wow, I had to find that euphemism, that's hidden in expenditures is in these massive omnibus bills. And I'll tell you something else. I've been totally unrelated, but I think it comes back around. A pox on both our houses. The Republicans for 7 years took to task Nancy Pelosi for saying we have to pass the bill so we can find out what was in it, and then tried to shove the AHCA through in 40% less time. And so I will admit the hypocrisy of that. We shouldn't be having to pass anything so that we can find out what's in it.
Dakota? All right. So we're going to switch here to, again, I just have to say, as the dean of a policy school, one of the most fascinating parts of running the school is we have 7 different policy centers that cover wildly different areas, and we are starting to probe into areas that even don't come up in our curriculum at the moment. So the next one has to do with internet privacy. This question comes from Luke Nicholson in Charlottesville, a Batten School student. Imagine if telephone providers were able to collect data on your phone calls without you knowing. I think we would all agree that world would be wrong. Earlier this week, Congress faced a similar question about internet privacy, namely, can internet service providers, ISPs, such as Comcast and AT&T collect data on our internet search history? You voted yes to allow that. Why do you feel that ISPs are not only entitled to this information, but don't need to ask for our permission to access it?
So what that bill dealt with was an administrative regulation that was promulgated, in December of 2016. And so it changed what had been the status quo for the entire administration precedent to a new status quo. And previously there was one federal entity of the FTC and the FCC that was able to gather data, okay? What that regulation did was it allowed 2 federal entities the ability to gather your data. It's doubled the number of federal entities that could gather your data. What's important to understand is what's not in the bill, and to understand the precedent law. The Telecommunications Act specifically prevents the gathering of individual data and collection and dissemination thereof. So it's already in the law. What the restriction that was repealed did was let a whole other federal 3-letter agency into your search history. Now, the differentiation that has to be made here is between your data, as in yours, and your data, as in yours. In other words, the collective collection of data can occur, but the individual collection of data may not occur. We can see what groups do, but we may not by law, under the existing Telecommunications Act, nor does this bill change that, see what individuals do. And so the reason that was a good vote is because we've already got one federal entity that was already in the business of looking at that data, and the rule that was promulgated by the previous administration went from 1 to 2. That's twice as many federal intermeddlers into my business. And it had nothing to do with your personal data. It had to do with collective data. So sometimes the devil's in the details.
Often. We're not going to let our young student here follow up with a second question, because he's already had 2 questions. Our next question is, this is one dear to the hearts of many people in Nelson County, and it has to do with the pipeline. Janice Jackson, are you still with us? Ms. Jackson, thanks for joining us. The Atlantic Coast Pipeline and property rights is the subject of this question. The ACP is slated to come right through my area. People's land will be taken against their will by eminent domain. You have said that you support property owners' rights. Given this, will you commit to oppose the President's agenda to expand fossil fuels and transportation systems thereof, like the ACP, which can only be built by violating property owners' rights?
I'm going to be consistent. I support pipelines and infrastructure. I don't necessarily support this pipeline. I will give you a word of personal warning. I was with an individual from Nelson County yesterday evening for dinner where I heard the story of the Dominion negotiator who came into their living room and said, if you don't agree to this, we're just going to take it. And let's see, let me make it clear how bad that is. That's a lawyer who negotiates for a living, walking into the living room of an unsuspecting private citizen and scaring the fool out of them and knowing, hey, I'm trained to do this. I do this with this house, this house, this house, this house along the route of the pipeline. So don't negotiate with them without the collective strength that you've created in resisting sort of Dominion's fiat. I believe that we need infrastructure to include pipelines. What I said again and again and again is I support pipelines. I'm not sure I support this pipeline. And don't let them bully you by telling you what they'll do until you've spoken with someone who tells you what they can and can't do. And the strength is in numbers. And candidly, while a lot of people, my wife, I don't know where we were, the opening of the salt mill facility in Buckingham, where somebody asked, how does he feel about the pipeline? And she told them, it blew their minds. Stand up and demand what rights you have. There is a real reason for eminent domain, and it may need to be implemented, but don't be bullied by a corporate giant who sends a lawyer unannounced to your house to tell you how they will treat you if you don't do what they say. Having said that, again, the pipeline needs to go somewhere if it's needed. I think it's needed. There are localities that have said they're interested. It's nuanced, but while I support pipelines, I don't support this pipeline the way they've been doing it. You think about that. Your job is to negotiate the best deal, the most efficient deal that you can to put a pipeline in a certain area. You do this professionally, and somebody doesn't know you're coming, then you go in their living room and start telling them what you'll do if they don't do X. There's a better way.
Ms. Jackson?
Well, it's been close to 3 years that we have been fighting this. I appreciate what you've said, but the question I wanted to get at, if you said in your town hall meeting that you supported individual property rights and people's property rights.
Right.
Well, this Atlantic Coast pipeline, and if you like to Google, you can Google and see pipelines all over the country where people's property rights are being trampled. The only way they can build this pipeline is to take people's property against their will by eminent domain, and we're talking a private for-profit corporation,
right.
And Nelson County is not going to get any of this, so we have no benefit. And it isn't a backyard thing. It is not right. We have people in my area, we have mountain hollows, and people have had their farms
right.
since after the Civil War, and they've held on to that. They do not want steep slopes. We have 178 acres that will be raised slopes that are at least 30%, some are 80%, mountains, streams. And so we're asking for you to speak out on this, and there is something very specific that you can do to help us immediately.
Okay.
There's something called the Draft Environmental Impact Statement that the FERC issued in December, and there was a lot of comment that went into that. People, interest groups, business, local governments, property owners, and the comments are due April 6th. However, after it was issued, and we're only talking 3 months, Dominion, the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, has issued 6,000 additional regulations and pages, and so those weren't incorporated. It is not fair.
Right.
It is not a fair process. What we want you to do is to request to the FERC that they rescind that and they start again. It is not a fair process. We can't comment on an additional 6,000 pages when we have a week left. So, I want you to answer first kind of the whole property rights and where the balance is between, I don't think there is a balance between property rights and a pipeline.
Oh my God.
Will you, yes, I feel like coughing and choking a lot. Will you help us immediately?
What I want to do is I want to look at the process. I will tell you that one of the most challenging courses I took in law school is environmental law. When you said draft EIS, I shuddered. I need to know what's going on that I don't know. Here's what I do know. I do know that the initial negotiations weren't. They were sort of shoving. I do know that there are, I won't say no. I'm very confident that there are routes that pipeline could go that were never explored for reasons that seem highly questionable to me as it relates to existing right-of-ways, existing tunnels, et cetera. Now but again, I said this earlier and I'll say it late. I'm not here to tell you what you want to hear. I'm here to tell you what I believe. There is a reason there isn't a constitutional eminent domain process we're taking. And I do believe that pipelines would fit with an infrastructure need that would qualify for eminent domain. They aren't doing it the right way right now. This can be done better. You have a right to fight this process, and it needs to be fair, and Dominion needs to not just look at the easiest way, they need to look at all the ways. And so I guess, again, it's nuanced, but I do believe that there is a reason for eminent domain. What we saw in Kelo versus New London was when the government starts taking it to build shopping centers to increase tax base, we've gotten beyond that purview, that legitimate reason. Having said that, yes, I won't completely vilify Dominion because they do provide a good or service that I enjoy and appreciate, and candidly, if you were to build a highway, it would be a private entity making profits on that too. So I promise you this, we will look at the process, where it is. I'll learn more about what they're listening to and not listening to, what they're promulgating after what FERC's put out that you will or won't have a chance to respond to. But right now, I'm not going to promise to do anything because I don't think that I know exactly the whole story, if you will, as to what has and hasn't been done. And I apologize for that, but there's a lot of stuff we're trying to wrap our brains around at one time. So I'm promising you to look at it, and I'm promising you that if and again, I'm not here kissing Dominion's ring, I can promise. And I don't like eminent domain, but I do think it's constitutionally permitted for a reason. I just don't know if this is the one. I don't know if we get there yet. If they can do it, look, there's probably going to be a taking somewhere. They should exercise the fewest possible takings that they can in building the infrastructure that we seek to justify using eminent domain, which should only be a last recourse ever anyway.
Well, they have not done that.
I don't think they have either. Conceivably, it could. Conceivably, it could. Well, yeah, sure. It goes back, again, to the Constitution, right? There's a reason there's eminent domain, and you can't build anything unless you live in a nation where the federal government owns everything without taking something that belongs to someone other than the federal government. The question is, does this fit the left and right parameters for what should be a legitimate taking? And I am saying that, yes, I think this could be a legitimate taking. I also think that because eminent domain should be exercised only as a last recourse, and I don't believe that Dominion has done their full due diligence, particularly as it relates to some routes across the mountains where there's access or at least right-of-way already available, by my understanding. They need to go do that before they start taking property, right? I don't like eminent domain. One of the things that I'm proudest of from my time in the Virginia Senate was a lady who had been subject, she and her husband, she doesn't want me to use her name, to a taking in the 1970s where they had to leave the house that they've been in since they've been married. And about 2015, she was about to be subject to another taking, and she was in her 90s and her husband was dead. And I said, not twice in one lifetime. And they were going to pay her a certain amount of money to take her home, the Commonwealth of Virginia was. And the amount of money that they were going to pay her was half the amount of money that they ended up paying her when they built a driveway from a back way in, right? So everybody won. Until you explore all the, she got to stay where she wanted to be, and we saved money as a Commonwealth instead of doing the entire taking by creating an alternate access to her home. I don't think we're there yet with Dominion. Having said that, I do believe that pipelines fit within infrastructure that would be appropriate for the application of eminent domain, but that eminent domain should only be a last resort. And I don't candidly believe that Dominion has explored all the options that they could. As it relates to the FERC and the draft EIS, I don't know what I don't know. I'm promising you I'll look at it. And I wish I knew everything I was supposed to know about everything, but I promise you I'm looking at an awful lot, and I hope that's been evident by my ability to comment on a breadth of subject matter here tonight.
Well, Congressman Garrett, we're coming up on our hard stop here of 8 o'clock. What I would like to do is first, I'd like to thank you for your energy and efforts here in answering all the questions that we've had for us. And second of all, I do hope that we'll be able to hold you to your commitment to another event like this, and we'll continue to scale up. I think that from my perspective as moderator and host, I'm very happy to say that this has been an outstanding exchange of views. Clearly, not everyone has agreed with everyone in the room, and nor has everyone agreed with you, but I think there are some areas of common ground, and so I look forward to future opportunities to pursue some of those. So, anything like you'd like to say in closing?
Yeah, I'd love to. First of all, thanks again for the amazing opportunity. Thanks again, whether you think I'm a wonderful congressman or the worst congressman ever, for caring enough to be here, because this is what drives the greatest nation on earth. And I will tell you that I'm delighted with the outcome, and I would say, I mean, I don't want to, I'll hang the sword of Damocles over my own head. After summer's over, maybe in the fall, let's try to get a venue about twice this big, I'm still not ready to sign up for 10,000. But let's try to get a venue and use a format that is well constructed and is professionally executed, as you all have. And if you know any of the folks who were in here earlier, tell them, and I mean this sincerely, thanks to them for caring enough to come out and be here. And we really want to have an honest discourse wherein they might walk away thinking, geez, Tom's horrible. But at least I listened, and at least I gave you what you're entitled to, which is, why is he doing what he's doing? And right, and that stinks that they had to do something that led them to be let outside. I mean, I'd love for them to have heard me in person, but they made a decision.
Well, thank you very much, Congressman Garrett. We appreciate your attendance.
That's awesome. Thank you.